You're so good.
Let's start. What is an argument? I was asked to include this, so I did. An argument is a positive reason for the judge to believe your side of the motion. So a negative reason might be to suggest some reason your opponents have presented does not obtain. That's not the same as making an argument which would work regardless of if you had opponents at all. So a successful argument has to be proven to be true, important, and unique to your side of the debate in order to work. Well, hopefully everybody already knew that, but just so we're on the same page. Problems in debating. Okay, so let's start with the regress problem. So let's suppose we were arguing that something was true, then we would probably have to give a reason for why it was true. And then it would seem that that reason we've just introduced itself requires a reason. And so it would seem that we would need to continue giving reasons forever. But unfortunately in debate we are limited to just a 7-minute speech. And then the second problem is the is-ought gap. So again, suppose we're arguing something is true. It doesn't seem like saying something is true gives us a reason to do anything. So if I say, it's raining outside, it doesn't really suggest that we should do anything. Perhaps if you don't want to get wet, you should bring your umbrella. But if you did not care about getting wet, then you shouldn't. So we can't say anything from the belief alone. And from that we can get to the second problem, which is why do arguments convince judges to support your side? So the role of intuition. So let's briefly talk about the globally informed citizen. So obviously in debate, the judge is not judging based on their personal preferences. So it's not like if the judge is like a raging libertarian, they're just going to give the win to whichever team makes free market arguments. They're supposed to be neutral, right? So in the rules we say they occupy the role of a globally informed citizen. So someone from no particular place in the world, without any particular fixed beliefs about the world, except the intuitions that an ordinary person has, the knowledge that somebody who reads the news regularly but without perfect memory would have. So this globally informed citizen has certain intuitions about what's true and what's important. So some of these intuitions we could say are priors about the world. So I have a very strong prior that the sky is blue in the daytime unless there are clouds. So it would be very hard for a team in a debate to persuade me that it was green or something like that. And then similarly, a lot of these intuitions are related to our values. So I have a strong intuition that it's good to make people happy, and it would be hard to convince me in a debate that it would be good to make people miserable or feel pain. So the key to overcoming the problems we discussed in the previous slide is to access these intuitions. So as long as the claims in my argument bottom out in something that, while it may not be objectively true, is at least agreeable to this globally informed citizen, then that suffices as proof for the purposes of debate. And similarly, if my argument bottoms out in some impact that is agreeable to a judge, then I've also succeeded for the purposes of debate in showing that it's important. So in this way, as in many other ways, debate is a very conservative activity in the sense that, although you might want to run bold and fun new arguments, they're often not very successful. Successfully accessing an intuition, it's more of an art than a science. And the reason for that is you're not exactly sure what intuitions your judge has or what intuitions they suspect the globally informed citizen has. So it's a probabilistic game. It has a lot to do with how you present your ideas and maybe a little bit less than we would like to think about what you're saying. So just keep that in mind as we go through the presentation. Okay, let's start the presentation. What is weighing? So suppose in some debate, government has proven something of consequence, and opposition has proven something of consequence. And further, suppose that no team has a sort of plausible way they could refute this claim that's been made by the other team. What are we supposed to do in this position? So what we're supposed to do is propose a metric of comparison by which we can decide which of these two claims that we agree is true, that we agree are important, which of these two claims is of the greater significance in the debate. And that's what we call weighing. So the above hypothetical debate occurs pretty commonly. It's very typical on a balanced motion that both teams, assuming they're reasonably competent, will prove something. And then, of course, we need weighing to decide which something is the most important. So note here that we don't need to explicitly weigh in every debate, right? So sometimes the weighing is going to happen implicitly. So if I'm making an argument that says something like, everybody in Canada becomes immortal, and my opponents are making an argument that one guy in Halifax will become displeased for a day. Right? This is not an argument I need to weigh up explicitly. The judge will do it for me because it's just so obvious. So you don't need to weigh every claim. You also don't need to weigh claims that are in contradiction with the entire case of your opponents, right? So if I'm saying such and such a motion will produce some effects in the world, and my opponents are saying they will produce the exact opposite effects, there's nothing to compare or weigh because we don't agree on the fundamental reality of what's happening. So think of weighing as after the debate has happened, after we've reached at least hypothetical agreement on what the motion will entail and what the consequences are like. In the aftermath, what ultimately should the judge decide? If you're in doubt, you should probably explicitly weigh. So if it doesn't seem to you that every single judge you'll ever encounter would weigh the claim the way you would weigh it, then you should probably do it yourself in your speech. But if you're pretty confident that any human being with a working brain would see it the way you see it, then you should probably just save your time and move on. Okay, does everybody understand what weighing is? Yes, incredible. How is weighing done? So here's a question. Why are you here listening to this seminar instead of studying? For some of you, there's no good answer to this question, but hopefully for at least some of us, there is an answer. And you have to give some answer, right? So you'll be tempted to give an answer that really is more of an argument. So you'll say something like, studying would have been even more boring than this. So, that sounds like an answer to the question that you're being asked, but it's not really what we're looking for. Surely, studying is always kind of a boring thing to do, but sometimes you study and sometimes you don't. So the question is not, is there this disadvantage to studying, but rather, in a particular situation, what's the decisive factor in you choosing or not choosing to study at that moment? So the real answer here is implicit, which is that in this case, for some reason, you've decided that minimizing your own boredom is the most important thing. So it's that kind of implicit judgment that we're looking to bring forwards when we're weighing a particular debate. So be cautious, right? Just referencing a reason that your side produces a benefit, referencing a reason that the other side produces a harm. This is not what weighing is. That's what argumentation is. The point of weighing is to kind of explain the trade-off, right? What we're getting and what we're giving, why that trade-off falls to your side of the debate. Common pitfalls. Okay, so we just discussed one common way that people weigh incorrectly. Sometimes people try to weigh just by referencing their argument. So on this motion, I've given the example, this House to ban homework. So opening government says something like, homework is stressful. Opening op says something like, homework reinforces learning. And these are very reasonable claims. This is a great example of a situation where weighing would be very important. It's not very useful for government to say, there's less stress on our side and more stress on their side. Why is that not useful? Question for the class. No answers? Okay. It's not useful because it doesn't do anything. So suppose I'm the judge, and for some reason I've got it into my head that it's always better to get rid of stress as opposed to reinforcing learning. Then you're already winning the debate if you've made an argument about reducing stress on government. And if you're a normal judge who is qualified to judge a debate round, you're not thinking that, right? You're actually unsure about whether reducing stress or reinforcing learning is more important in this case. So simply reiterating the point that you reduce stress is not weighing in a meaningful sense, because you're not weighing something that's under contention. The second thing that often happens in weighing, usually this happens in the last 20 seconds of a whip speech very desperately, is people just weigh by begging the question. So they'll say something like, well, we're closing government, they're opening government, we weigh over them because we gave better reasons for our arguments, and they also happen to be more important. Now again, we run into the same problem, right? If I, as the judge, happen to believe that, then that's great for you, but you didn't need to say it, I already thought it. And just the act of you declaring yourself to be better than another team is not a reason that you're better than the other team. So if I was unconvinced, I'm no more convinced now. So the point I'm trying to make here is that the idea behind weighing is you're trying to take some claims, maybe just one claim on each side, maybe a whole basket of claims on each side, and you're trying to take these claims that are in a state of sort of ambiguity. We're not exactly sure which of these claims or basket of claims is more important, and now we are trying to make it so the judge is sure, or at least has an idea. So if you find yourself weighing and you're not doing that, you're probably just wasting your time. How should weighing be approached? So just like anything in debate, I mean, there's no objective formula I can give you to spit out the best argument, the best response, the best way. The best I can do is give you some advice that you can follow, and hopefully in time it will improve your weighing ability. So the first point I'd like to make note of here, the importance of learning from experience. So remember what we said at the start of the presentation, right? When we are trying to weigh, there's nothing rational about the act of weighing. Like maybe it would be helpful to give an example. So let's go back to the motion we were working with a second earlier, right? This has to ban homework. And government is trying to say again, homework is stressful, and op is trying to say homework is educationally valuable. Now, believe it or not, there is nothing in the universe that says one of these things is better than the other, and it is entirely up to the values of the listener to decide what is more important. But the other problem is debate is very bad at assessing quantity. So presumably if people lost all stress for the rest of their lives, that would be a good reason to prefer reducing stress in this case. Whereas if we only reduced a little stress for a temporary period of time, it would not be so important. So the question that can never really be answered in a debate speech is, obviously, if there's enough of one good and a deficit of the other good, we would like the first good in some situations. And at some point along the spectrum, we lose some of the first good, we gain some of the second good, it flips over, and now we prefer the opposite trade-off. At what point does this flip happen? Nobody has an answer, no judge knows, and so there's nothing rational happening here. You are just trying to riz the judge to think that your point is more important, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. So keeping that in mind, the most important thing that you can do is when you participate in a round of debate and people are weighing things against each other, keep a note in your feedback, like wherever you're writing that down at the end, did this work or not? Right? And that's the golden test for if a weighing metric is useful or not. So if you're noticing, oftentimes this will be with respect to a particular type of motion, right? So you'll notice that there's a clash that seems to unfold across many motions in a similar way. And in this clash, one team usually tries to weigh in this particular way, I guess, ironic. And then, if it works, that's something you want to steal. And then in future debates like that, you can use the weighing metric. Now, if you don't have any experience, as I assume many of you in the room don't, just try wacky stuff and see if it works. Most of it won't work, but some of it will work, and then you can add that to the arsenal. So I give some examples here of metrics that I have found to be frequently useful. Perhaps in 6 months they will not be useful anymore, but that's not my problem. So the 4 metrics here. The first is certainty. So the idea here is a claim that is more certain to materialize is more important than a claim that is quite uncertain. So we're going to go through an example of that at the end. Don't worry about that for now. The second metric is duration of impacts. This is a very common one. The idea that certain impacts in a debate have far-reaching positive consequences that seem to suggest to us a greater quantity of good on the whole than impacts that might strike us as good but only manifest over a short period of time. So if you can argue that your impact has some positive cyclical effect, maybe homework reinforces learning, kids earn more money, they put their kids in better schools, and then they break the poverty cycle, right? That's a way to extend the impact over a long period of time. But stress is temporary, right? It's only for a couple of years that you're in school. So that's a way you could use this metric. The third metric is logical priority or replicability. So these are similar but not the same. Logical priority says in order to get one good thing, you need another good thing. So maybe in order for kids to learn anything at school, they have to be engaged. To be engaged, they don't have to be stressed. Okay, so now obviously we have to prefer reducing stress because we don't get any learning on their side if we're stressed. And replicability is a similar but not quite the same idea. So I might say the more moderate version of the claim. Well, if I'm doing homework less and I'm less stressed, maybe I learn more when I'm at school. And this is not exactly saying that to learn anything, you can't be stressed. Instead, it's to say that in the process of being less stressed, you also get some learning. So if we get some learning on both sides, but in one side people are way more chill, maybe we prefer that side. And then the last metric, uniqueness of impact. So the idea here is, in any given debate, there is a fairly narrow range of reality that's being considered in most cases. And so one question you might want to ask is, let's say that we can get maybe some desirable policy that we want, but it will come with some drawbacks. A question you could ask is, how easy would it be to achieve that policy through some other means, right? And if the answer is, it would be very easy to do this in another way with no drawbacks, or the problem will work itself out, that probably suggests that maybe op is correct in this case. And if the policy is maybe the only way to overcome a problem we know we're going to have to overcome, then this perhaps suggests that we should just eat the cost because we're going to have to do it at some point. Okay, so those are some example metrics. I'll stress these are not the only weighing metrics. They will not work in every round. Every round is different. You have to think of your own. These are just some helpful ones to get you started. The second piece of advice I'll give, construct your case with weighing in mind, right? So you can think of it as sales. If I have like a piece of shit car, it looks horrible, the paint job is rusting, I'm going to have to be a pretty good talker to sell that to a customer, right? So if you are not a great talker, then what's the easiest thing to do to sell the car? It's probably to paint it. So in the same way, I mean, if your case sucks all the time or you never respond to your opponents, you might just not be able to do anyway. So, work on that first. And obviously, everybody can make an argument and give a response. Just getting better at these things will make weighing easier. But the second and more subtle piece of advice is that intentionally constructing your case around a weighing strategy is kind of important. So the idea here is, a lot of people approach the prep period just kind of randomly, like they sit down with their partner, like, haha, our side sucks so much, I wish I was on the other side, and they think for a little while. And then they're like, well, here's an idea that came to me, and then my partner's like, that's crazy, the same idea came to me, let's say that in our speeches. So, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. It seems a little random to be effective, right? So here's something you could do to make the case more strategic from the outset. You could say, okay, probably we're going to say this, because I thought of it in 30 seconds. Now let me think about the other side for 30 seconds. And then you would wait 30 seconds, and you would say, okay, now I know what the other side's going to say. So is there some way that I can set up the case to plausibly beat whatever they're going to say, even before I hear it said? And if you can think of a way to do that, that's a great thing to do. You won't be able to think of it all the time. I can't think of it all the time. But it's worth a shot, and it'll be helpful. Questions about this? No? Okay, there will also be questions at the end. Lots of time for questions. Okay, example. So we've got a long motion here. This is a round I did many, many years ago, actually yesterday. So the motion reads, this House, as the African Union, would aggressively intervene in coup situations in Africa. I won't insult your intelligence by reading you the whole info slide. I'm sure you guys can do that. But yeah, that's roughly what we're talking about. Okay, so
we are on opening opposition. What should we say? So this is kind of an approach that we might take to designing a case around a particular weighing metric. And here my advice would be, I have some experience from previous rounds of debate about intervention. So any situation where a country is trying to intervene in a hostile manner into the affairs of another country via an invasion or sanctions or some form of pressure. I've experienced in these rounds that certainty is a valuable metric for the side opposing the intervention. So I'm going to kind of recognize that opportunity and then kind of decide in the preparation period to make this the centerpiece of the strategy for the team in the round. So in order to make that the centerpiece of the strategy, we need some ingredients. So here's our first ingredient. We need a reasonably impactful argument we're pretty sure is true. So at the end of the argument, even at the end of the responses from the other side, it's going to be difficult to call this argument into such question that we don't reach a reasonable degree of impact, right? That doesn't mean it can't be mitigated at all. It just means we have to be able to achieve roughly what we set out to achieve. The second ingredient we need is a reasonable assurance that the core arguments of our opponents can be cast into doubt. So whatever the opponents are going to say and what they're going to focus on constructively, that needs to be something that we could have confidence that we're going to be able to question in a significant way. And then the final thing we need, of course, are the responses that we think are going to enable us to achieve B, right? So in a way, B and C go hand in hand. You probably have the assurance that the arguments of your opponents can be cast into doubt because you have some idea of what you might say to cast them into doubt. But let's leave that for a moment. Let's kind of now see, do we have these ingredients to kind of make our plan work? Spoiler, we do, but I just want to talk about what they are so you can get a sense of the strategic picture. So ingredient one, that was our certain argument. So we can probably find our certain argument in this intervention round in terms of the harms that are going to attend any sort of aggressive intervention. So if we think of sanctions, we can think of the harms to civilians, whether it's the goods that they can no longer receive or receive as cheaply, or the underemployment or unemployment caused by dampening exports. So sanctions are somehow restricting the flow of goods in and out of the country, and that's going to have some harms. And then similarly, if there's a war, obviously there are going to be some harms to innocent people. So there's our argument, right? It's quite difficult to disprove that war kills civilians, quite difficult to disprove the claim that sanctions are bad for civilians. So there's our certain argument. Moving to ingredient two, their shaky argument. So we're thinking about an intervention motion. Why would you intervene in another country knowing that we are going to kind of bring about these harms? Well, we're going to intervene in this other country, presumably because we think we can make things better in that country in some way. So we can intervene and we can topple a sort of authoritarian government, we can restore a legitimate government, we can force constitutional change. Maybe in a more moderate kind of government case, we can just pressure or use leverage on the regime to achieve some changes. So something to do with going in and making things better on the ground. So is this point shaky? I think it is. I think the reason it's shaky is we have some very difficult questions to answer from the perspective of government. So the first question in this case is, why should we think that the African Union's intervention will succeed at pressuring or toppling the target regime? So lots of kind of difficulty here. It doesn't seem like, in modern times at least, that just kind of having a superior economy or a larger population base or a larger military is enough to ensure a successful intervention into another country. And the example I gave in person, I'll give it again, is Afghanistan, where obviously the United States failed to do what the AU is trying to do here. So why do we think this is going to work out? It's a difficult question. And then secondly, why should we think that such a success will benefit the citizens living in the country being intervened in? So the question here is, and again I'll use an American example, like after we topple Saddam Hussein in Iraq, what assurance do we have that Iraq is going to be better off, meaningfully better off, right? Remember, because the invasion itself is costing us something, meaningfully better off than it was before. And there are all kinds of challenges here, like how are we going to set up a governance structure that is better than the one that was before, and how are we going to ensure that that's a stable form of government that doesn't just kind of immediately collapse as soon as we leave. And related questions like why should we think the AU is going to hang around to bring about this kind of good state of affairs? And so I think the argument is shaky, and we've identified the second ingredient. And now ingredient 3, very related to what we just discussed, are responses. So because these are complex questions, and it's difficult to get a good answer for government, I mean the corollary of that is it's easy for opposition to bring about an unfavorable answer to these questions. So how might we do that? We're just generating some response ideas here. So we could say that whatever regime we're intervening in is for some reason strong. We could say that countries within the African Union are not going to want to participate in this sort of intervention. We could argue that after the intervention, let's assume it succeeds to some extent, they don't really have the capacity to bring about a positive state of affairs. So, I mean, this is going to vary based on the government case, right? If the idea from government is we'll go in and we'll get rid of the government by force and replace them, the argument is probably like the AU doesn't really have the financial resources or the political capital to reshape a country in such a way that before any of this coup stuff happened, it couldn't have been a democracy, but now it can be. They can't even solve these problems in their own countries. Much richer countries can't even solve these problems. So that's kind of the idea. With a more moderate government case, which might be about like achieving leverage, the concern would probably be, well, how does the African Union intend to kind of hold the government to account after it withdraws? So is it kind of a situation where the regime institutes some constitutional changes that are negative, you leave, how can we ensure that that government remains faithful to the Constitution going into the future? And then the last kind of type of response is, we could say the AU has perverse incentives about how to treat the state it's going to subjugate post-intervention. So the idea here is, the states that comprise the African Union have their own interests, and perhaps those interests will conflict with the interests of whatever state they're going into. So the example I think in the debate, when I did this debate, was Rwanda. It's kind of famous for denying this, but supporting and sending soldiers into the DRC to harvest their resources. And so in a similar way, you could imagine a bunch of countries in Africa going into Mali or going into Chad, and maybe not treating those countries well, even though they have achieved regime change or something like that. So those are our ideas, right? And those are all the ingredients we need for a successful weighing plan. So we're going to take our argument, which is quite certain. We are going to heavily respond to their argument, which we know to be vulnerable in this particular way. And then we're going to end one of our speeches by saying something like, Panel, we are talking about innocent human lives in this debate, and government is certain that some of those lives are going to cease and more of them are going to get much worse as a consequence of what they're doing. If we are sure that there is this high cost intervention, we had better be further sure that something good is going to come of it, and we don't have that certainty. That's why you should vote opening opposition. And some sort of line like that really consolidates all of these ingredients into one cohesive plan, and you're presenting the plan to the judge in a way that hopefully they will find an intuitive way to evaluate the debate. So that is hopefully everything I was supposed to say. So I will stop the recording now.